In order for government to be of the people, by the people, and for the people, the politics. And it's got to get closer to the people. I'm John McCann, and this is the Closer to the People podcast, a production of North Carolina Black Alliance. It's a special edition of the podcast because we've spent this podcast season leaning into and up to the November 5th election, exploring the right to vote, looking at the idea of what it means to build black political power. Check out past shows at ncblackalliance.org/podcast. Now, while this is election season, it's also hurricane season, and I'm stating the absolute obvious when I tell you recovery from Hurricane Helene is really just beginning. That work will be with us for a long time. We continue to think about our neighbors in Western North Carolina. You know how in life in general, when something bad happens to you, everybody swoops in to love on you real hard, right? And then just like that, everybody's gone. But the pain is still there. That's Hurricane Helene. Lots of attention now, wall-to-wall news coverage. That's going to stop before long, but the houses down there will still be uninhabitable. Folks will still be struggling, feelings of loss, of home and heart. So I'm just saying, let's keep them in mind, all right? Now, here's the other thing. I called this a special edition of the podcast because we won't spend this time leaning into voting rights. We're going to get into Hurricane Helene. We're going to get into environmental justice issues like climate change and clean air, which actually means this really is not a special edition. Because environmental justice, when you really think about it, environmental justice is always on the ballot. You'll hear that reflected in my conversation with Jeffrey Robbins. He's the executive director of CleanAIRE NC. AIRE is spelled A-I-R-E, which stands for Action and Innovation to Restore the Environment, A-I-R-E. Now, on the campaign trail, talking politics now, you're not hearing environmental justice clearly articulated by the right. You're not hearing it from the left either. It's because we have to put it in the center. Here at NC Breathe 2024, a conference convening thought leaders and subject matter experts to address the tension that exists between environmental factors and human health. The visionary behind that is Jeffrey Robbins, the executive director of CleanAIRE NC, and he's taking a breather. I'm assuming it's clean air he's breathing, taking a breather to give me a little time. Brother Robbins, I appreciate you.
I appreciate you, Brother McCain.
You know, it's one thing to see a news story here or read an environmental piece there, but for me to spend a day hearing your peers engage in such thoughtful conversation about the intersection of health and environment frames it differently. Like the idea that we have a right to clean air, that's new for me. I have a right to not be discriminated against, a right to vote. Breathing clean air, where is that in the Constitution?
Well, I think you have to look at the Clean Air Act, right? And I'm sorry, I mispronounced your name. I said McCain instead of McCann.
That
Brother
happens
McCann.
from time to time. You know, if you look at my wallet and you'll be like, no, he's not the rich white GOP member John McCain. So we'll go right ahead, sir.
So yeah, we tend to take a lot of our direction and insight from the Clean Air Act, right? And the Clean Air Act was passed years ago as a means of protecting those that are living in the environment from harmful substances and emissions. And so it's one of those components of, you've got the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and then you've got Title V and Title VI. And those are all of the laws that were amendments or signed into law by various presidents to protect the environment. And so we believe at Clean Air that everyone has a right to clean air because there are different industries that we know perpetuate. There are different things like transportation that are driving the emissions. We now have solutions that we didn't have historically. The right comes from, there are definitely dichotomies within our communities where the differences between the haves and the have-nots. In Charlotte, we see it's the crescent wedge phenomenon, right? Where those communities that were historically redlined are those that are more susceptible, more exposed to heavy industrial traffic and transportation emissions and other things that affect their ability to enjoy clean air. So we take the perspective that people have a right. And that is the prevailing theme of our organization. That's what we fight for. And until we get to that point where it is an equitable standing for everybody to have access to clean air, we're going to be in business and we're going to be continuing to fight for that.
Hurricane Helene, so much destruction. The recovery is going to take a minute. Now, we expect that kind of catastrophic flooding on the lowlands of the coast of North Carolina, not the mountains with all that elevation. Might get a good wildfire in western North Carolina, but not the extreme flooding that we saw. Should Helene be the closing argument on whether or not climate change is real?
You know, that's a great question, because in my mind, it really is a canary in the coal mine, right? Because I think when you look at what we know is happening on the coast and you see the actions that cities like Miami, where they're building not just the homes on stilts now, but the streets are being elevated to accommodate for impending storm surge. And I call it, I think, Helene in western North Carolina is a canary in a coal mine because it was completely unexpected. And if you look at the causal impact, and I'm not a meteorologist, but I can look and see what I see when a hurricane hits the coast, whether it's the Gulf Coast in Florida or the eastern coast or the eastern seaboard, we're going to be impacted because the size and the magnitude of these storms. And I tell my family and friends all the time, the outer bands of a hurricane, when I first moved here into North Carolina in 2009, rarely reached Charlotte. Now, Charlotte has a history where Hurricane Hugo came in and pretty much wiped out the entire city. That was an anomaly years ago, 20 plus years ago. Now, the last 3 hurricanes have impacted the inner side of North Carolina. It's not just the coast anymore. And when you look at the magnitude of these storms, Helene touched not just North Carolina, it touched Tennessee, it touched the Ohio River Valley, it's gone up through the Midwest, and now it's impacting the upper Northeast. So the magnitude of these storms, where they're generating so much energy because the oceans are warming, right? We know that. These aren't like philosophical Jeff Robbins opinions. These are scientifically proven phenomenon where what fuels hurricanes? What's fueling them is the increase in climate heat, the heat of the oceans, and that's giving, what we're seeing with these large storms. And it's not going to end.
Okay, here's my issue. We hear all of this information, the experts at this conference, they're coming with all this knowledge, and yet, Mr. Robbins, I recently heard about the state of California suing Exxon because Exxon has allegedly been playing fast and loose with their recycling claims, and what was thought to be getting recycled has amounted to, quite frankly, a bunch of garbage. What are regular people like me supposed to do with that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that's where, first and foremost, CleanAIRE NC is in the business of educating and raising the level of awareness, right? And that's been one of the things that I've tried to strive for is I think we have an opportunity to advise and inform and educate communities so that they understand the concepts, the issues, and the parameters around what's driving all of this. Now, what Exxon has allegedly done, and I've read the case and I kind of understand where they are. Plastics is one of those things where I think our perception is that they're recyclable, especially you see the number of people using plastic water bottles. Those types of things, plastic is one of those things that we had a whole day yesterday on PFAS, which is forever chemicals. Plastic is one of those substances that just simply doesn't break down. And it breaks down into such small forms that it is part of the microplastic phenomenon where we're seeing it in animals in the wild, we're seeing it in humans. And so the complete eradication and non-use of plastic is ultimately where we need to go. But what does that look like and what are the steps to take that? And I think that's where the folks in the sustainability space are starting to look at alternative methods of packaging the goods and things that we consume. And if we can start with small steps, right? And I always tell people, hey, take your own reusable shopping bags to the grocery store so you don't have to use plastics. There's places like New York and California that don't hand out plastic bags anymore for groceries. So small changes like that, I think, are where we are. Now, corporations that have access to research dollars and funding have a responsibility to tell the truth, right? And that's where they have consumers, they have people that are using their services. They should be forthright with the information about what plastic impact is. And I think that's where the state of California is calling foul, because they are touting recycling in the plastic space that is just totally not true, considering the amount of incineration and burning that they do to then arrive at a recycled product. So we take exception to that. Anything that burns and creates carbon output, we have a problem with that. And so philosophically, their methods, I think don't align with what conventional wisdom tells us, as well as the science.
Among the impacts from Hurricane Helene are potential hardships for voters. Election Day is November 5th. In-person early voting in North Carolina starts October 17th and ends November 2nd. Absentee voting is underway, yet those impacted by the storm may wonder how they're supposed to cast an absentee ballot when their mailboxes are washed away or compromised roads are keeping the mail from getting delivered. The State Board of Elections has answers by phone at 919-814-0700 or through emailing elections.sboe@ncsbe.gov. A really good online resource is ncsbe.gov/Helene, Helene. It's where voters can find out, for example, whether their local elections office is closed. So that's ncsbe.gov/Helene. North Carolina Black Alliance remains closer to the people by making sure the ballot box is within reach of the people.
Let's keep it 100. You see my bank account? Whoever gets elected ain't doing nothing about none of that.
You say that like I got money. We up in the sports bar. You saw what I just ordered. Listen, remember when those cops had your son jammed up on some nonsense?
Had me shook. That judge down there, at the courthouse worked it out.
She got voted in by people like us. Well, people like me, because you don't vote.
I keep seeing all these ads about the presidential election. I don't even really think about voting for judges.
So you're voting, right?
All right, I get it.
All that complaining. Sound like my wife.
Why are you over here talking about me again?
My fault, baby. Now, you're wondering how come this podcast was late.
I was giving you time to get the last one straight.
Check out past episodes of the Closer to the People podcast at ncblackalliance.org/podcast. That's ncblackalliance.org/podcast. Okay, I'm just going to altogether take back what I said about this being a special episode. It's not, because this environmental stuff has everything to do with the upcoming election, because one of the issues in the presidential debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump was what? Fracking. Not that you can explain what it means, but Chad Martin can. He's an environmental justice policy strategist for North Carolina Black Alliance. I caught up with him during the NC Breathe conference for a little private breakout session we're going to call What the Frack? Chad, we'll keep the politics out of this.
Okay.
What is fracking?
Yeah, for those who don't know, it's really about those companies going into the ground, pulling out those minerals, for people to use, like the lithium batteries, what they use for solar, things of that nature. And one of the issues is it always happens inside of our communities. And when I say our communities, BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous, people of color communities. And so if you pull that stuff out, eventually it's getting into the air, it's getting into our lungs. We just saw the issues that we have in North Carolina, especially with 2.5 particulate matter, and how it increases with asthma, it increases mental health issues. And so this is one of the reasons why a lot of people are saying no to fracking.
So that explains why it's a political issue. Candidates are trying to dodge it and dance around it.
Definitely.
As a voter, what should we be listening for when politicians start talking about fracking?
So one of the biggest issues is if they are for it, what kind of practices they have around it. What are the regulatory pieces to make sure to keep people safe? I know when they were talking about uranium mining, the expert said it's not an issue to where if the community is going to be affected, it's when is the community going to be affected. When you look at uranium mining, the tailings, we did a study, those tailings are lighter than balloon. And so what we did, we took balloons and put them in the air and put on a little sheet saying, call me wherever you get this. We had people calling from New York. We had people calling from New Jersey, just people from all over. And so the tailings are lighter than those balloons. So that means those tailings, when you pull it out from uranium mining, they can go everywhere. It's not just indigenous to where they're fracking the area, they're digging in the area. So we're trying to make sure people are protected, even if governments are going to go along with fracking.
Is it an all or nothing type of situation?
The problem is we all have these little devices in our hand. We want constant power all the time. And so if we are not trying to find some kind of clean energy source or willing to scale back as individuals and as groups, then we're going to always keep having these questions about how we are making sure we have enough energy to keep going in this society.
Why is this an issue in black and brown communities?
It's so important in black and brown communities because this is the areas where they dig. This is the areas that are affected the most. This is the areas where it gets in the air, so it affects your air quality. When those tailings come down, it gets in the water, so that you're drinking this. It gets in the land, so when your kids are out there playing, have their hands in the dirt, their feet in the dirt, this is the stuff that the kids are getting infected by.
But are you saying are the particular things that they're digging for, they're only found in black and brown communities, or that's just where the digging occurs?
So it's found in a lot of communities, but it's more heavily in black and brown communities because that's exactly where they dig, and so you're closer to the issue. And there's a historical narrative here. When you get back to what the government did when it comes to lending for houses and this term that we call redlining, what happened is they deemed certain areas okay for black people to live in, and they deemed certain areas for white people to live in to keep us separated. Now you juxtapose those maps that were redlined where we were allowed to live, and you look at environmental justice issues, they overlay with each other. And so what's happened is the very areas that they said were okay for African Americans to live are the very areas they target to pull these things out of the ground. And so it is not by coincidence, it is systematic.
And to be proactive, what can I do about it?
Good question. We talked to one attorney. It was very strategic on how she said it. She said, find a animal. Right, that sounds crazy, right? Find a animal that might be on the list that's endangered, because you can actually utilize that animal to protect your area, because now they can't just go in and start digging because this is a protected area. If it's a wetland, if it's endangered species there. That was just from one perspective. But two, I would definitely start, and we try to do this, educate people on the EPA EJ screen mapping tool, and you start seeing the overlays of where asthma, and a lot of people think it's genetic. It has nothing to do with genetics. It has everything to do with geography. Oprah Winfrey has a special that deals with health, and she said your most determinant issue about your health is your zip code. And so where you live plays an important role about your health, whether you have access to healthcare, whether you have access to hospitals. We also provide maternal health. And so do you even have an OBGYN that you can access? Or do you have to drive, like some people in North Carolina, 2 hours to get healthcare? We know because of CAFOS, we know because of PFAS, Cape Fear River, which 1/5 of every North Carolinian drinks from, is infected by the CAFOS, the pig, swine, poultry farms, and how those lagoons are. And we know just what happened with Hurricane Helene, that North Carolina floods. And so that pig feces doesn't just sit in those lagoons. Now that it's flooded, now that stuff rises out of those lagoons and now gets into the drinking water, gets into the Cape Fear River. And so we have comorbid issues that we have to worry about. We have just issue on top of issue on top of issue. And so to have fracking is just another one of those issues that would be detrimental to our health.
Chad Martin, thank you for keeping us informed.
Thank you, sir.
Let's pick up my conversation with Jeffrey Robbins. He's the executive director of CleanAIRE NC. He gave me some time during NC Breathe 2024, a conference where thought leaders explored the complex relationship between environmental factors and human health. The early October gathering in Durham, North Carolina was at the JB Duke Hotel on the campus of Duke University. Let's go back inside. There was some information shared during the keynote address that reminds me of the civil rights movement. Good cause, it's noble, it's right, but man, it takes a long doggone time.
It does.
So selfish me would rather let somebody else deal with all of that, because the civil rights movement and civil rights is more tangible. We could see lynching, and we could see dogs being sicked on people. I can see job discrimination. What's the environmental justice equivalent?
Yeah. I think it's the things that we see and deal with in communities around the state of North Carolina. You know, as a state-based organization, we get to the western part of the state in the mountains, and we get to the Piedmont, the middle of the state, and we get to southeastern North Carolina. And in most of the situations that we see, there's a heavy correlation between those impacted communities and what they are in terms of Black, brown, indigenous people, right? And we hear the term BIPOC, and we see when we go into these communities that the majority of the people that are being disproportionately impacted are Black and brown folks. And so if you take a look at areas of southeastern North Carolina, what we call CAFO country, there is a definite focus around helping the majority of people that are Black, brown, low-income white folks that are being impacted by commercial agricultural farming.
What was that term again?
CAFO.
CAFO?
Yeah, concentrated animal feed operation. CAFOs are pretty prevalent in Sampson County, and when we look at those communities, predominantly most of them are Black. And so when you go back in time, and you know the start of the environmental justice movement happened in Warren County, North Carolina, where there was a chemical plant that was dumping tainted soil in a community into the landfill. And that was the first instance in this country where a community took action against the offending company to stop that process. And they were successful in doing it. And so we look at it and we call it environmental justice because it does impact predominantly Black and brown communities and lower income Americans. And so that's kind of the connection, and it's really one of those things that we see, whether it's red line communities in cities where we know the gentrification process, right? And that's the transition of homes that were once owned and lived in by African Americans that are now in those key areas that now folks want to get back to. So white flight, we're seeing it in reverse. So there's a heavy correlation between all of those factors that lead to the environmental justice movement. I think you made a really good point in terms of things do take time, right? Because we heard yesterday and today, evidence, fact base is where it starts. If you have that information, then you have the basis of taking legal action or making changes through policy and advocacy. And that's what we do as an organization.
All right. I'm trying to make the comparison between environmental rights and civil rights.
Right.
It took a minute to get everybody on the civil rights bus.
Right.
Am I wrong to say that the environmental justice bus has a lot of seats left for people like me who are just, like I'm on it a little bit, but I ain't really comfortable. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah. And
So help me get comfortable on the bus to where I sit down, I buckle up, and settle in for this ride.
Yeah, that's a great question because, I mean, to be honest with you, I got into this space. I spent 29 years in corporate America working for large corporations, making billions of dollars and impacting the environment. And there was just something wrong with that, right, in my mind. It didn't align with where I wanted to go and what I wanted my legacy to be in terms of what is my impact on the environment. I think we all have our own journey in terms of how we arrived there, and it will be one tipping point. And for me, it was 2 years ago when I came across this organization. And Duke Energy has a carbon plan, And the carbon plan stipulates that by 2030, 2050, they will be at net zero. And that's a heavy loft in terms of getting there. But I was involved in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Climate Leaders Organization to look at Duke's procurement of renewable energy equipment. Since I have a background in supply chain, that was a natural thing for me to analyze. And when I looked at their rate and their processes of procuring large amounts of equipment, it didn't align with when I had done the same thing for Motorola or Tyco in my past careers. And that was a red flag for me. So I got involved. I did an analysis. I then went and testified in front of the North Carolina Utilities Commission. I marched in a rally. I gave speech, and it gave me a sense of purpose. And I tell people that was my epiphany in terms of what my purpose here is when I saw the prevalence after going and get a master's in sustainability, and you start to see around the world the folks that are impacted predominantly are black and brown and indigenous people. And so if that doesn't give you purpose, then I encourage people to go out to a community. We as an organization have a responsibility to educate and raise the awareness because it's not easy concepts to talk about, hey, why does the earth warm, right? Those are things that people don't really understand. Our job is to demystify it, first of all, put it in simple terms, right? Because it's not that our community is ignorant, well, they are ignorant, because ignorance means without knowledge. Understood. It's not stupid, it's not dumb.
Understood.
So we have a responsibility and an opportunity to educate people and raise the level of awareness so that our job is to inform communities on what they are being impacted. Once they get that information, we teach them how to advocate. And so that's where it starts. And it's not an easy process, John, because I think, it's a long road to hoe, but we're in it for the long term. Right.
It can feel like you and your peers get together and you read papers and you talk about studies, but man, we want to see action.
Yeah.
Help us hang on with y'all and ride with you a little bit longer.
Yeah. So that's a great question again, and I think for us, it's really about we're in before this conference, 4 of us went up to Fayetteville. There's an organization or a community there that's being surrounded by a company called Fay Block, right? And Fay Block is a manufacturing of cement blocks, and they do cement services. And as you can imagine, the production of cement blocks causes a lot of dust.
Yeah.
That's particulate matter, right? And we know that some of that dust can potentially contain silica. Silica is a known carcinogen, right? So our first step is to help monitor what is happening in those communities. So we spent time with the community installing monitors, and then we had a session with community members to give them the terminology and the information, right? Once they have that and we have that information, we have them as members in our organization, we can then sit down at the table with an SELC and have a conversation about, hey, we've got this evidence, here's what we're seeing, here's the health impacts of what that looks like. We need to start the process of advocating for them to change. Right? Because in that process, Fay Block has been given procedurally through their air quality permit the requirements of mitigating dust and any of the emissions that come off of there. We now have to hold them accountable, right? And I think that's where community gets more engaged when they see people that are actually listening to them and then helping them take action. Not doing it for them, but helping them take action. And the more that we can communicate these stories and start to scale our impact and work with partners like you all and everybody that's here, that's how we'll start to get to that critical mass moment.
In other words, there is plenty of room for all of us on the environmental justice bus. Even folks like me whose mind is really just beginning to thaw to the idea of global warming. Jeffrey Robbins says, get on the bus. It's not too late. It takes time, but it's not too late. And it's not somebody else's job, because what if that had been the approach with civil rights? Think about those who boarded the civil rights bus and did not benefit from the privileges we have today. Think about those who didn't board the environmental justice rights bus sooner, and maybe, I'm just saying maybe, Hurricane Helene might have still come through screaming, but perhaps not quite as loud. This has been the Closer to the People podcast, a production of North Carolina Black Alliance. Let me know what this show can do to get closer to you when you reach out and touch me at john@ncblackalliance.org, and check us out online at ncblackalliance.org. That's ncblackalliance.org. Until next time, keep in mind, a government of, by, and for the people has to get closer to the people. Think about this. You're standing in line to vote. It's a long line. You've been waiting a long time. You finally get to the table to get your ballot, only to be told, "I'm sorry, but you're not registered to vote." From the start of 2023 through August 2024, county boards of elections in North Carolina removed some 747,000 ineligible registration records from the state's voter rolls. Were you one of them? Better check. Find out at safevoternc.org. In-person early voting starts October 17th and ends 3 p.m. November 2nd. There is same-day voter registration during in-person early voting. The deadline to request an absentee ballot is 5 p.m. October 29th. Election Day is November 5th. Details about all of that are at safevoternc.org.